Hi there. Welcome to NapTime History channel. Tonight we're stepping through the cobblestone streets of Renaissance Rome, where the scent of incense mingles with cheap perfume, and the bells of St. Peter's compete with the laughter spilling from brothel windows. You're about to witness a world where papal processions literally stepped over prostitutes sleeping in doorways, where cardinals blessed crowds by day and visited courtesans by night, and where the holiest city in Christendom ran on an economy of sin that would make even the devil blush. Fair warning, you probably won't look at Renaissance art the same way after learning which saints' faces were actually modeled by the Vatican's favorite working girls. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing this little community of night owls scattered across the globe. All right, let's begin the story. You're standing in the Borgo, that cramped neighborhood hugging the Vatican walls like a needy relative, and the year is 1490. The morning sun hasn't quite burned through the river fog, but already the streets pulse with life. A cardinal's carriage rattles past, wheels splashing through puddles that reek of last night's chamber pots, while his footmen clear a path through vendors hawking everything from holy relics to considerably less holy services. You dodge a procession of pilgrims, their eyes fixed heavenward, completely oblivious to the woman in the doorway, adjusting her bodice with practiced precision. She catches your eye and winks. Business hours start early in the shadow of St. Peter's Dome. The irony hits you like a slap from an angry nun. This is supposed to be the spiritual center of the Christian world. Yet every third building seems to house what the locals diplomatically call a stufa, literally a bathhouse, though everyone knows the only thing getting cleaned there is your coin purse. You count at least 6 such establishments on this street alone, their shutters painted that particular shade of red that needs no translation. A young priest hurries past, clutching his breviary like a shield, his eyes darting nervously between the heaven he's supposed to be contemplating and the earthly temptations beckoning from every doorway. You follow the main thoroughfare toward the Ponte Sant'Angelo, that ancient bridge where Hadrian's tomb looms like a stone guardian over the Tiber. Here, the prostitutes work in shifts as regular as the canonical hours. The morning girls are just arriving, replacing their night shift sisters who trudge home with the weary gait of workers everywhere. Some wear yellow veils. The laws attempt to mark them like livestock, while others risk the fines and dress like respectable matrons. Historians still argue whether these dress codes were about public morality or just another Vatican tax scheme dressed up in righteousness. The smell of fresh bread from a nearby bakery mingles with something less appetizing, the Tiber at low tide, carrying away the detritus of a city that considers itself too holy for proper sewers. A group of German pilgrims stumbles past, still drunk from last night's adventures in the taverns that conveniently cluster near the brothels. One of them sports a black eye and a satisfied grin that suggests his evening prayers took an unexpected detour. Their guide, a local Roman with the ethical flexibility of a contortionist, is already steering them toward a money changer who'll give them just enough coin for another night of cultural immersion. You pause at a street corner where a Dominican friar thunders about the wages of sin to a crowd that includes at least 3 women he'll probably be visiting later. The mainstream historical fact that everyone conveniently forgets is that by 1490, Rome had more registered prostitutes per capita than any other European city, roughly 1 for every 12 adult males. The friar quotes scripture about Mary Magdalene while carefully avoiding eye contact with a courtesan named Lucrezia, who everyone knows has half the curia wrapped around her perfumed fingers. As church bells mark the 3rd hour, you realize this isn't just a story about sex and scandal. You're witnessing an entire economic ecosystem built on the fascinating hypocrisy that even today makes historians squirm. The quirky tidbit that most textbooks skip: many Roman prostitutes actually owned property near the Vatican, becoming landlords to the very pilgrims who came to have their souls cleansed. Talk about diversifying your portfolio. The Pope's private banker clears his throat nervously as you peer over his shoulder at the ledgers spread across his mahogany desk. The numbers don't lie, even if everyone else in this holy city does. The column marked Revenue from Public Women shows entries that would fund a small cathedral. You're deep in the Vatican's administrative quarters now, where the real miracle isn't turning water into wine, but transforming sin into gold coins that somehow smell like sanctity by the time they hit the papal coffers. The banker, a Florentine with fingers stained by ink and conscience stained by compromise, explains the system with the detached precision of a man who's learned to separate his soul from his profession. Every registered prostitute pays a weekly tax, officially for public health inspections, though you both know the only thing being inspected is their ability to pay. The unregistered ones face fines that conveniently match whatever coins the papal guards find in their purses. It's a protection racket that would make the Borgias proud. And speaking of the Borgias, they haven't even arrived in Rome yet to perfect the art. You watch a procession of women filing into the tax collector's office, each clutching their payment like a perverted form of tithe. The irony is thick enough to choke a cardinal. These women fund the very churches where priests condemn them every Sunday. One courtesan, dressed in silk that costs more than a parish priest sees in a year, drops a heavy purse on the counter with a smile that suggests she knows exactly whose bed that gold came from. The tax collector, a deacon who somehow reconciles his holy orders with his unholy occupation, marks her payment in a ledger bound in leather that probably came from the Vatican's own workshops. The mainstream historical fact that makes modern Catholics squirm is that Pope Sixtus IV, yes, the one who built the Sistine Chapel, officially licensed Rome's brothels in 1471 and took a healthy cut of the profits. His successor, Innocent VIII, despite his ironic name, not only continued the practice, but expanded it, arguing that regulated vice was better than uncontrolled sin. You've stumbled into the Vatican's dirty little secret. The budget for some of Christianity's most sacred buildings included line items that would make a madam blush. Behind closed doors in the Apostolic Palace, cardinals debate theological minutiae while their own household accounts show regular payments to laundresses who've never touched a bar of soap in their lives. You glimpse Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia's personal expense records. In just 5 years, he'll become Pope Alexander VI, and notice entries for maintenance of female friends that exceed what most bishops spend on charity. The hypocrisy is so brazen, it's almost admirable, like watching someone juggle flaming torches while insisting fire doesn't exist. A young secretary rushes past, carrying documents sealed with the papal arms, and you catch a glimpse of the contents, property deeds, transferring ownership of buildings in the Borgo, the quirky historical tidbit that nobody mentions in Sunday school. The Vatican owned significant real estate in Rome's red light districts, collecting rent from the very brothels it publicly condemned. Some of these properties came to the church through the convenient deaths of wealthy courtesans who, seeking to buy their way into heaven, willed their establishments to the Holy See. The church would solemnly accept these gifts, promise prayers for the departed soul, then lease the building right back to the next madam at double the rate. You follow the money trail deeper into the Vatican's financial labyrinth, where accountants perform mathematical gymnastics to transform vice revenues into virtue budgets. Historians still argue whether Pope Innocent VIII's famous declaration that God desires not the death of sinners, but rather that they live and pay, was about spiritual salvation or fiscal solvency. The evidence in these ledgers suggests he had a very worldly interpretation of rendering unto Caesar. The afternoon light streams through stained glass windows, casting colorful shadows on documents that detail the papal government's cut from gambling houses, taverns, and yes, the extensive network of brothels that operated with all the efficiency of a modern franchise system. Each establishment pays for its privilege to operate, plus additional fees for prime locations near pilgrimage sites. You're looking at the Renaissance equivalent of a sin tax, except instead of cigarettes and alcohol, it's levied on humanity's oldest profession. The money flows upward through layers of bureaucracy, each official taking their cut until it reaches the papal treasury, cleansed and sanctified by creative accounting. You're climbing the Spanish steps. Well, they won't be called that for another 2 centuries, but the slope is already there, toward the residence of Imperia Cognati, Rome's most celebrated courtesan, whose marble bathtub is rumored to have cost more than a parish church. The distinction between the women you're about to meet and those huddled in the Borgo's doorways is like comparing a Raphael fresco to a tavern wall scrawling. These cortigiane oneste, the honest courtesans, occupy a social stratum that exists nowhere else in Europe, and you're about to learn why cardinals write them poetry while their their housekeepers, seethe with jealousy. Imperia's doorman, a former Swiss guard who found private employment more lucrative than papal service, eyes your clothes with the calculating gaze of someone who can spot a counterfeit ducat at 50 paces. You pass inspection, barely, and enter a world that smells of Arabian incense and Venetian perfume rather than the usual Roman cocktail of sweat and sewage. The entrance hall displays more art than most churches. A Madonna and child that looks suspiciously like Imperia herself holding someone's illegitimate baby. classical statues in positions that would make a gymnastics instructor wince, and tapestries depicting mythological scenes where Zeus seems particularly interested in transforming into various animals. The lady herself receives guests in a salon that would shame most cardinals' reception rooms. Imperia, draped in silk that shimmers like oil on water, speaks Latin as fluently as any Vatican secretary, quotes Petrarch without missing a beat, and plays the lute well enough to make angels jealous, or at least that's what Bishop Sadoleto wrote in his last sonnet to her. You're witnessing the Renaissance ideal of the educated woman, except she happens to charge by the hour for her conversation. The mainstream historical fact that scholars love to debate is that many of these high-class courtesans were better educated than noble wives, who were kept deliberately ignorant to ensure their virtue. The hierarchy among Rome's sex workers is more complex than the Vatican's own bureaucracy. At the top perch, perhaps 24 women, like Imperia, who choose their clients like a sommelier selects wine. They maintain their own households, employ secretaries to manage their correspondence with lovesick humanists, and throw dinner parties where cardinals debate Plato between courses. Below them, the cortegiane di candela, candle courtesans, time their services by how long a candle burns, a sort of Renaissance parking meter for passion. Then come the cortegiane da gelosia e da impanata, who work behind windows and shutters, advertising their wares like displays in a shop window. The streetwalkers occupy the bottom rungs, divided into those who work the taverns, those who haunt the bridges, and the truly desperate who service customers in the ruins of the Colosseum, because nothing says eternal city like conducting business where gladiators once died. Each tier has its own unwritten rules, territorial boundaries enforced with the kind of violence that would make the Praetorian Guard proud. You learn that crossing from one zone to another without permission can result in a face slashing that ends careers faster than syphilis. A quirky historical detail that makes you reconsider everything. Many successful courtesans actually employed other prostitutes, creating elaborate hierarchies within single households. Imperia herself maintains a staff of 6 younger women who handle the clients she deems beneath her attention. Literal subcontractors in the business of love. They live better than most Roman wives, eat meat daily, and dress in cast-off silks that would bankrupt a merchant's daughter. The system works like a twisted finishing school where young women learn languages, music, and poetry alongside skills that would make their mothers faint and their fathers reach for their swords. You're introduced to Matrena non vol, whose nickname, Mother Doesn't Want Me To, comes from her practiced protests that somehow never quite stop anyone from proceeding. She specializes in cardinals who need to feel their corrupting innocence, a psychological service that commands premium prices. Historians still argue whether these elaborate role plays were early forms of therapy or just evidence that human nature hasn't changed much in 5 centuries. She shows you her collection of gifts, rosaries blessed by various popes. The irony is not lost on anyone. Jeweled crosses that once adorned episcopal fingers, and enough holy water to baptize half of Rome. The afternoon wears on, as you observe the careful choreography of this world within a world. Servants announce visitors with coded phrases that indicate everything from the client's spending power to his particular preferences. A banker arrives for his weekly Latin lesson, while a visiting ambassador claims he's commissioning a portrait. Everyone maintains the fiction that these women are simply very friendly hostesses who happen to accept expensive gifts. The real portrait being painted here is of a society that's mastered the art of seeing without acknowledging, of knowing without admitting, of condemning in public what it celebrates in private. The bells of Sant'Andrea della Valle haven't yet rung for matins, but you're already following Lucrezia through her morning routine in a house that smells of last night's wine and this morning's regrets. She kneels before a small shrine to Mary Magdalene, patron saint of reformed prostitutes, though Lucrezia shows no signs of reforming and mutters prayers in Latin so mangled it would make a seminary student weep. Her fingers work through ivory rosary beads that once belonged to a bishop's mother, a detail she finds endlessly amusing as she prays for the soul of the son who gave them to her after a particularly energetic evening of definitely not discussing theology. The prayer finished, she transforms from penitent to businesswoman with the efficiency of a Medici banker. Her account book, hidden behind a false panel that also conceals love letters from 3 different cardinals, reveals the kind of mathematical precision that would impress a Venetian merchant. Yesterday's earnings, 2 ducats from the silk merchant, who likes her to speak only Greek, 5 from the papal notary, who insists she wear his late wife's clothes, and a ruby ring from someone marked only as Tuesday's regular cardinal. She adds the figures with a stylus, muttering about the rising cost of beeswax candles and how the new sumptuary laws mean she'll need to bribe twice as many guards to wear decent silk in public. You watch her negotiate with Giovanni, the 11-year-old messenger boy who coordinates appointments with the precision of a papal secretary organizing a conclave. He rattles off the day's schedule. The Flemish merchant at noon wants the usual. The canon lawyer at 3 specifically requested you wear blue, and that new secretary from the apostolic chamber says he can only afford an hour, but promises to pay in advance. As Lucrezia sorts through the requests like a duchess reviewing invitations, rejecting a notorious non-payer and accepting a nervous young priest who she knows will spend more time crying about his sins than committing new ones. The mainstream historical record tells us that Roman prostitutes were required to attend confession weekly, creating the bizarre situation where the same priests who visited them Monday through Saturday would absolve them on Sunday. Lucrezia prepares for her weekly confession with the kind of strategic planning usually reserved for military campaigns. She mentally sorts her sins into categories. The venial ones she'll admit to, working on feast days, taking the Lord's name in vain when that banker's check bounced, and the mortal ones she'll creatively rephrase, helping lonely clerics find comfort somehow becomes providing Christian charity to those in spiritual distress. Her toilette is an art form that would rival any papal ceremony. She mixes her own cosmetics in ceramic pots, following recipes passed down through generations of Roman courtesans. White lead for the complexion Ignore the fact it's slowly poisoning her. Belladonna drops to dilate her pupils, creating that dreamy look poets write about, and a lip rouge made from crushed beetles that costs more per ounce than communion wine. The quirky historical detail that nobody mentions is that many prostitutes actually sold their beauty recipes to noble ladies through intermediaries, creating a bizarre economy where respectable women paid to look like the whores they publicly despised. A client arrives early, a nervous youth whose peach fuzz beard suggests this might be his first visit to any woman, let alone one who operates in the shadow of St. Peter's. Lucrezia switches into character with the skill of a consummate actress, becoming whatever fantasy he's scraped together enough coins to afford. You notice she charges him half rate and sends him away with advice about washing more frequently and perhaps trying to speak to ordinary girls before returning to professionals. It's a moment of unexpected tenderness in a business transaction, like finding a pressed flower in an account ledger. The afternoon brings her regular confession with Father Antonio, though you notice this confession happens in her bedroom and involves significantly less clothing than canon law recommends. The hypocrisy is so thick you could spread it on bread. But there's something almost touching about how they maintain the fiction. He genuinely seems to believe that, by absolving her afterward, he's somehow helping her soul while satisfying his body. Historians still argue whether these priest-prostitute relationships were purely transactional or if genuine affection sometimes developed in the gap between what heaven demanded and what flesh desired. As evening approaches, Lucrezia prepares for her most lucrative appointment, a banker who likes her to read Dante while he lies with his head in her lap, fully clothed, weeping for the wife who died in childbirth 3 years ago. She charges him triple her normal rate, not for sex, but for the emotional labor of being his confessor, therapist, and grief counselor rolled into one. She smooths his hair while reciting passages about Beatrice, and you realize that perhaps the oldest profession isn't really about sex at all. It's about providing whatever form of human connection the client can't find elsewhere. Purchased intimacy for those who've forgotten how to achieve it naturally. The yellow veil flutters in your face like a flag of shame as you adjust it for the 100th time today. The coarse fabric scratching against your forehead where the cheap dye has already begun to stain your skin. You're experiencing firsthand what every registered prostitute in Rome must endure. The sumptuary laws that mark you as clearly as if they'd branded whore across your forehead in scarlet letters. The wool is deliberately rough, designed to irritate, because apparently the lawmakers believe that constant physical discomfort might inspire moral improvement. The logic is about as sound as believing that standing in the rain cures drought. You navigate the market near Campo de Fiori, where vendors suddenly charge you double for bread and triple for vegetables, because everyone knows a woman in yellow has money from shameful sources and therefore deserves shameful prices. A group of apprentice boys follows you, making kissing sounds and offering crude suggestions about what services you might provide for a handful of copper coins. Their master, a blacksmith who probably visits the brothels every payday, does nothing to stop them. After all, you're wearing yellow, You forfeited the right to basic respect, along with the right to choose your own wardrobe. The law is specific to the point of obsession. Yellow veils for common prostitutes, striped hoods for the Jews, and bells for the lepers. Rome loves its human categorization system almost as much as it loves breaking its own rules. You must wear the yellow veil whenever you step outside. Cannot enter churches during Mass, though you're welcome to clean them afterward. And God forbid you should walk past a religious procession without immediately prostrating yourself in the mud. The fine for wearing normal clothes is 25 ducats, more than most prostitutes earn in a month, and the guards who enforce these laws have been known to demand payment in services rather than coin. But here's where Roman ingenuity shines brighter than any yellow fabric. You've learned the tricks from Violante, a veteran who's been dodging sumptuary laws since before Pope Innocent VIII started pretending his own bastards were his nephews. She shows you how to fold the yellow veil so small it practically disappears into your hair, ready to be yanked out at the first sight of a guard. Some women carry two cloaks, a yellow one hidden underneath a respectable brown one, ready for quick changes in doorways. The truly clever ones have developed an entire sign language to warn each other when guards are approaching. A silent symphony of gestures that would make the Swiss Guards' military signals look primitive. The mainstream historical fact that makes this even more absurd is that these laws were reissued roughly every 3 years, each time with greater penalties and less effect. By your count, Pope Sixtus IV alone issued the Yellow Veil Edict 4 times, each proclamation admitting that the previous one had failed completely. It's like watching someone repeatedly try to nail word to a wall, then blame the water for not cooperating. The quirky detail that historians love to cite: many Roman prostitutes actually owned yellow silk veils worth more than entire wardrobes, turning the symbol of shame into a luxury item that mocked the law's intention. You duck into a church, technically illegal, during daylight hours, but the sacristan is conveniently nearsighted when silver changes hands. Inside, you observe the ultimate irony: a group of noble ladies praying at a side altar, their faces piously downturned, wearing veils of every color except yellow. You recognize at least 3 who are kept mistresses of various cardinals, maintained in luxury apartments, draped in jewels, but because they service only one man at a time, they escape the yellow mark. The law, apparently, is less concerned with the sin of prostitution than with the efficiency of its practice. A particularly zealous Dominican friar spots you and begins a theatrical display of outrage, pointing at your yellow veil as if it might spontaneously combust from the force of his righteousness. He quotes Leviticus at volumes that echo off the stone walls, spittle flying with each condemnation. The noble ladies clutch their rosaries and inch away from you as if prostitution were contagious, though you notice one slips a coin into your hand as she passes, perhaps recognizing that there, but for the grace of a wealthy protector, goes she. Historians still argue whether these public shamings were meant to reform prostitutes or simply provide free entertainment for the righteous. As sunset approaches and the bells ring for vespers, You join the stream of yellow-veiled women heading back to their quarters. The guards at the city gates perform their evening harassment, demanding to see permits, checking that veils are regulation length, and collecting inspection fees that go straight into their purses. One young guard, newer to the job and still possessing a functioning conscience, looks ashamed as he takes your coin. You almost feel sorry for him. He'll learn soon enough that shame is a luxury nobody in Rome can afford, whether you're wearing yellow or purple, selling your body or just your soul. Cardinal Giuliano della Rovere adjusts his scarlet zucchetto one final time before slipping through the unmarked door on the Via dei Coronari, where the afternoon shadows provide just enough cover for a prince of the church to maintain plausible deniability. You follow at a discreet distance, watching one of the most powerful men in Christendom navigate the familiar route to his favorite establishment with the practiced ease of someone who's made this journey more times than he's said Mass. The irony isn't lost on you. This is the same cardinal who just this morning delivered a blistering sermon on the sins of the flesh, his voice echoing through St. Peter's with enough righteous fury to make the statues blush. Inside Francesca's establishment, the air is thick with frankincense, the same grade used in the Vatican's highest ceremonies, because apparently even whorehouses have standards when catering to ecclesiastical clients. The decor strikes a bizarre balance between brothel and basilica. Crucifixes hang on walls alongside mirrors positioned for decidedly unholy purposes, and the beds are draped with fabric in liturgical purple. You're witnessing the Renaissance art of compartmentalization, where men of God check their vows at the door like coats at a dinner party. Francesca herself, a woman who could teach Machiavelli lessons in political maneuvering, greets the cardinal with a curtsy that manages to be both respectful and mocking. She's assembled his usual selection, Maria the Venetian, who bears an unfortunate resemblance to his sister, make of that what you will, and young Benedetta, whose specialty is reciting scripture while performing acts that would make the saints weep. The cardinal pretends to deliberate, though everyone knows he'll choose both and charge it to his charitable works budget. The Vatican accountants have developed a blind spot for these expenses that's more miraculous than any biblical healing. The mainstream historical record confirms that Cardinal della Rovere kept at least 3 mistresses simultaneously while accumulating ecclesiastical offices like a collector hoarding rare coins. What the history books politely omit is that he often brought his fellow cardinals along for these adventures, turning Tuesday afternoons into an informal meeting of the Sacred College of Extremely Fallible Cardinals. You peek into the main salon where Cardinal Ascanio Sforza is engaged in what he'll later describe as ministering to fallen women, though his version of ministry involves considerably less clothing than the Gospels recommend. A young priest bursts through the door, panic written across his face like a confession he can't quite vocalize. He's new to Rome, fresh from some provincial seminary where they apparently still believe in celibacy, and he's just discovered that his superior, the very bishop who assigns penances for lustful thoughts, is upstairs engaged in activities that would require a lifetime of Hail Marys to absolve. Francesca handles him with the smooth efficiency of someone who's dealt with countless crises of faith, offering him wine mixed with something that will help him forget what he's seen, or at least make it seem like a particularly vivid dream. The quirky historical detail that nobody mentions in seminary is that many Roman brothels actually employed chaplains, defrocked priests who'd found a new calling in providing spiritual comfort to working girls and absolution to guilty clients. Father Lorenzo, Francesca's house chaplain, waddles over to comfort the traumatized young priest. He's a walking contradiction, tonsured like a monk, but dressed in silk like a merchant, blessing the wine with one hand while accepting payment for last rites with the other. He explains to the horrified newcomer that God's mercy is infinite, which in Rome apparently means infinitely flexible. You witness the evening's most surreal moment when Cardinal della Rovere emerges from his activities to conduct an impromptu theological debate with a visiting German theologian who's wandered in thinking this was a legitimate inn. The cardinal, still adjusting his robes and with lipstick visible on his collar, launches into a passionate defense of papal infallibility, while Maria the Venetian nods along, occasionally correcting his Latin. The German, too polite or too confused to leave, finds himself arguing the finer points of transubstantiation with a half-dressed cardinal and a fully naked courtesan who apparently has strong opinions about the Eucharist. As midnight approaches and the cardinals prepare their alibis for tomorrow's morning prayers, you realize you've witnessed something more complex than simple hypocrisy. These men genuinely believe they can serve both God and their gonads, switching between sacred and profane with the ease of changing vestments. Historians still argue whether this represents the ultimate corruption of the Church or simply humanity's eternal struggle between spiritual aspiration and carnal reality. The answer, like Cardinal della Rovere's hands, is probably somewhere in the middle, reaching for heaven while firmly grasping earthly pleasures. The pustules on Marco's face weep like tiny stigmata as you help him stumble toward the Ospedale di San Giacomo, Rome's newest attempt to contain what locals call the French disease, though the French, naturally, call it the Neapolitan disease, and everyone blames everyone else for the plague that's rotting genitals faster than you can say Ave Maria. You're witnessing the early years of syphilis in Europe. When the disease is still so virulent, it can kill within months, turning its victims into walking advertisements for the wages of sin. Marco, a banker who spent liberally in the brothels near the Pantheon, now finds his gold can't buy him a cure for what's eating away his nose. The hospital corridors reek of mercury and prayers, the two main treatments offered with equal futility. Doctors, if you can call them that, apply mercury salves that poison their patients almost as efficiently as the disease itself, while priests perform last rites with the weary efficiency of farmers harvesting a particularly abundant crop. You pass a ward full of clergymen, their ecclesiastical status evident from the quality of their beds, if not their symptoms. A bishop lies delirious, calling out for someone named Lucrezia, while his secretary frantically assures visiting dignitaries that His Excellency is merely suffering from an excess of holy visions. Sister Bernardina, one of the few nuns brave enough to work here, shows you the women's ward, where the mathematics of misery become clear. For every infected cardinal tucked away in a private room, there are 20 prostitutes crammed into communal beds, sharing their suffering like they once shared their clients. The disease doesn't discriminate by class, but the treatment certainly does. The mainstream historical fact that makes modern readers squirm is that syphilis spread through Renaissance Italy faster than the plague, carried along pilgrimage routes by holy men who collected both indulgences and infections with equal enthusiasm. You meet Giovanna, once one of the most sought-after courtesans in the Borgo, now unrecognizable beneath the ravages of tertiary syphilis. She laughs, a sound like broken glass, as she tells you about the cardinal who infected her. He's receiving private treatment in the Vatican while she rots in this public ward. He blessed me with one hand and cursed me with his cock, she says, her gallows humor intact even as her body falls apart. The other women nod knowingly. They all have similar stories of holy men who left them with more than just coins and regrets. The quirky historical detail that nobody mentions in medical texts is that Roman prostitutes actually developed their own early warning system for diseased clients, sharing information through an elaborate network that would make modern epidemiologists proud. They kept lists of infected men, passed along through madams and messengers, though the system broke down when it came to powerful clients. Who was going to tell a cardinal that he was on the do not service list? Instead, they developed inspection techniques that would make a horse trader proud, checking for telltale signs by candlelight before any clothes came off. Dr. Torella, the Pope's own physician, arrives for his weekly rounds, and you watch him perform the delicate dance of treating ecclesiastical syphilis without acknowledging what it is. He's developed an entire vocabulary of euphemisms: French gout for genital chancres, celestial fire for the burning sensation during urination, and divine trials for the dementia that comes with late-stage infection. His treatment notes read like theological texts, discussing the mortification of the flesh when he means the flesh is literally dying. He prescribes pilgrimages to holy sites for bishops whose legs are too rotted to walk to the latrine, let alone Loretto. The evening brings a fresh horror. A young prostitute, no more than 15, arrives with her newborn baby. Both show signs of congenital syphilis, the infant's body already marked by the sins of clients the mother can't even remember. Sister Bernardina baptizes the child quickly, knowing it won't survive the night, while the mother begs for last rites, though she's years from death. A slow execution by disease that makes burning at the stake seem merciful. Historians still argue whether the explosion of syphilis in Renaissance Rome represented divine punishment or just the inevitable consequence of a city where celibate men vastly outnumbered available women. You leave as the Angelus bells ring across Rome, their bronze voices calling the faithful to prayer while the infected writhe in their beds. Outside, life continues as if a fifth of the population isn't rotting from the inside out. Cardinals still visit brothels, prostitutes still work the bridges, and the great machine of Roman vice grinds on, lubricated by denial and mercury ointments. In the distance, St. Peter's dome rises like a great stone bubble, beautiful and perfect against the sky, while beneath it, the diseased and dying bear witness to the fact that all the holy water in Christendom can't wash away what happens when flesh meets flesh in the shadow of the Vatican. Father Benedetto's confessional booth smells like guilt and garlic as you squeeze inside. The wood still warm from the last penitent, probably Maria the laundress, whose sins involve significantly more than dirty linens. You're about to witness the greatest theatrical performance in Rome, the weekly absolution of prostitutes by the very priests who know them in the biblical sense. The irony is thick enough to choke on, like trying to swallow communion wine while it's still fermenting. Through the latticed screen, you can see Father Benedetto nervously adjusting his stole, preparing to hear confessions from white women whose bed sheets he's blessed in decidedly unofficial ways. The first prostitute enters, and you recognize Isabella from the establishment near the Ponte Sisto. She kneels with practiced piety, crossing herself with fingers that just this morning were counting coins from Archbishop Carafa's purse. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned," she begins, her voice carrying the rehearsed quality of someone reciting lines in a play everyone's agreed to perform. "It has been 1 week since my last confession." Father Benedetto shifts uncomfortably. He knows exactly what she's been doing for the past week because he was there for Tuesday's particularly athletic session involving creative interpretations of the Song of Songs. The confession unfolds like a negotiated treaty between warring nations. Isabella admits to occasions of impurity without specifying that one of those occasions involved the confessor himself. Father Benedetto assigns penances with the arbitrary nature of a merchant haggling over spoiled fish. 3 Hail Marys for working on the feast of Saint Agatha. 5 Our Fathers for taking the Lord's name in vain, specifically when that overweight cardinal couldn't perform and blamed divine intervention. Neither mentions the elephant in the confessional booth, that this entire sacrament is a cosmic joke, like asking a wolf to guard sheep while wearing wool costume. The mainstream historical fact that makes Catholic historians squirm is that confession was mandatory for prostitutes, but optional for their clients. The Fourth Lateran Council required all Christians to confess at least annually, but somehow the enforcement focused entirely on the sellers rather than the buyers of sin. You watch a parade of women cycle through, each performing their part in this sacred farce, while their clients, including several you recognize from last night's revelries, stroll past outside, their souls apparently less in need of cleansing than their hired companions. Between penitents, Father Benedetto shares wine with you from a flask hidden in his cassock, explaining his theological gymnastics with the weary air of a man who's rationalized himself into moral knots. "I absolve them of the sin," he says, "not the profession. God forgives the act, not the necessity." It's logic that would make Thomas Aquinas weep, but in Rome, even theology bends to accommodate reality. He tells you about Cardinal Piccolomini's solution, a special plenary indulgence for prostitutes that wipes their slate clean every Easter, like a spiritual bankruptcy that lets them start accumulating sins fresh for the new liturgical year. The quirky historical detail that nobody mentions in seminary is that some confessors actually developed a sliding scale of sins based on the client's ecclesiastical rank. Servicing a layman, standard fornication, 10 Hail Marys, a priest, add 5. Our fathers for contributing to clerical corruption, a bishop, better throw in a rosary, a cardinal. That requires a pilgrimage, preferably to somewhere far enough away that you won't run into him at the market. The Pope? Well, technically that's not a sin at all. It's practically a form of papal service, like being a very specialized chambermaid. The afternoon brings Lucrezia Normana, the most theologically educated prostitute in Rome, who treats confession like a doctoral defense. She argues with Father Benedetto about the nature of sin, citing Augustine and Jerome with the fluency of someone who's had plenty of time to read while waiting for clients to recover between rounds. If Mary Magdalene could be saved, she points out, and she didn't even have to deal with bishops who cry about their mothers during sex, then surely there's hope for us all. The priest has no good counter-argument, especially since she knows he's been skimming from the poor box to pay for his weekly visits. As the day wears on, and the confessions blend together into a litany of sexual peccadillos and ecclesiastical embarrassments, you realize you're witnessing something profound about human nature. These women don't really believe their confessions absolve them any more than Father Benedetto believes his absolutions mean anything. But they go through the motions because the alternative, admitting that the entire system is a sham, would require confronting truths too uncomfortable for anyone to face. Historians still argue whether this represents the ultimate corruption of the sacrament or its most honest expression. Flawed humans fumbling toward grace through whatever rituals help them sleep at night. The wailing pierces the morning air like a blade through silk as Sister Margarita carries another tiny bundle to the turnstile at the Ospedale Santo Spirito, where unwanted babies disappear into the Holy Spirit's dubious embrace faster than coins in a cardinal's purse. You're standing at Rome's most heartbreaking intersection, where the children of prostitutes and prelates alike get deposited with the same casual efficiency as letters in a postal box. The baby she's carrying can't be more than 3 days old, its cries already weakening from hunger because its mother, one of the registered courtesans from the Borgo, can't afford to keep a child that would end her career faster than syphilis. The turnstile, or ruota, is ingeniously designed to preserve anonymity while condemning infants to institutional oblivion. Sister Margarita places the baby in the wooden cylinder, rings the bell, and rotates it inward, where another nun waits to collect Rome's newest orphan. No questions asked, no records kept of the mother, just another mouth for the Holy Spirit to feed, assuming it survives the first month, which statistically speaking, it won't. The mainstream historical record shows us that the mortality rate in these foundling hospitals exceeded 60%, making them less nurseries than particularly slow-acting forms of infanticide. You follow the baby's journey into the hospital's infant ward, where the smell of sour milk and soiled swaddling clothes could knock a condottiere off his horse. Rows of cradles stretch like a miniature necropolis, each containing a small tragedy wrapped in the cheapest cloth the hospital could find. The wet nurses, mostly prostitutes themselves who've recently given birth, move between the cribs with the mechanical efficiency of workers in hell's own assembly line. They're paid a pittance to nurse multiple infants, their own milk diluted among too many mouths, creating a mathematical equation where supply never meets demand and the deficit is counted in tiny corpses. The hospital's records, which you examine with the administrator, a priest who's developed the 1,000-yard stare of someone who's seen too many dead babies, tell their own story. Each entry is a masterpiece of ecclesiastical euphemism. Child of unknown mother. Everyone knows the mother. She works 3 streets over. Infant of uncertain parentage, the certainty being that the father wears red and says Mass. Foundling discovered at church door, deposited by the church's own sacristan on behalf of his employer. The quirky historical detail that nobody mentions is that many of these children bore suspicious resemblances to high-ranking churchmen, leading to an entire generation of Romans who looked remarkably like their spiritual fathers. Giovanna arrives at midday, her face a mask of resignation that cracks only when she sees her daughter among the foundlings. She's been visiting daily for 3 weeks, ever since economic necessity forced her to give up the child, the result of a liaison with a banker who promised support until his wife found out. The nuns allow her to nurse the baby, one of the few maternal moments she'll have before returning to work tonight, servicing men who might father the next generation of abandoned children. The cycle is as predictable as the liturgical calendar and about as likely to change. The children who survive infancy face a future that makes their beginning look promising. Boys might become priests. The church loves recruiting from its own bastards, creating a circular system where abandoned sons of clerics grow up to father their own abandoned children. Girls face bleaker prospects, domestic service if they're lucky, the convents if they're pious, or following their mother's footsteps if they're realistic. You meet Antonella, now 15, who survived this very hospital and works in the laundry while waiting to age into the only profession that will have her. She knows her mother was a prostitute, her father was probably a priest, and her future is as predetermined as a saint's feast day. The hospital's most grotesque tradition is the annual lottery, where wealthy Romans can adopt foundlings as servants, selecting them like melons at the market, cardinals seeking page boys, merchants needing shop assistants, and madams looking for future employees all participate in this human harvest. The children parade past in their best clothes, still pathetic by any standard, while potential masters assess their teeth, posture, and perceived tractability. It's slavery with extra steps and a papal blessing, justified by the fiction that any life is better than dying in the hospital. As evening falls and you watch Sister Margarita prepare for the night shift of abandonments, you realize you're witnessing a system perfectly designed to perpetuate itself. Prostitutes produce children they can't keep, who grow up to become prostitutes who produce children they can't keep, while the men who father these children continue visiting brothels to create more foundlings. Historians still argue whether this represents social pragmatism or institutionalized cruelty, but the infants dying in their own waste don't care about academic distinctions. They just cry until they can't anymore, their voices joining the eternal chorus of Rome's unwanted children, echoing through stone corridors that have heard too many last breaths and not enough lullabies. The coins clink in Tommaso's leather purse with the satisfying sound of sin converting to silver as he makes his rounds through the Borgo, collecting this week's protection money from the brothels that line the narrow streets like corrupt pearls on a rosary. You're following Rome's most successful pimp, though he prefers the title business facilitator, as he demonstrates how prostitution money flows through the eternal city's economy like blood through a diseased body, necessary for life but toxic to the soul. His ledger, written in a code that would make Vatican cryptographers jealous, shows payments to guards, bribes to inspectors, kickbacks to cardinals' secretaries, and donations to conveniently blind parish priests. The first stop is Maddalena's establishment, where 6 women work in rooms that rent for more per month than a craftsman earns in a year. Maddalena counts out the coins with fingers gnarled from decades in the trade, each silver piece representing countless moments of rented intimacy. 20% goes to Tommaso for protection, 10% to the local constable to look the other way, 15% to the building's owner, a monastery that officially doesn't know what happens on its property, and another 10% for miscellaneous expenses, a euphemism for keeping the right people happy. What's left barely covers food, clothing, and the mercury treatments that promise to cure what Roman knights have infected. Tommaso explains the economics with the passion of a professor lecturing on Aristotle. A successful brothel, he says, generates more revenue than most merchant shops, but the overhead is crushing. Beyond the official taxes that remember that crocodile dung sunscreen from ancient times, well, Roman prostitutes pay a similar premium for basic necessities, as every merchant in the supply chain takes their cut from the sin economy. Bakers charge double for bread delivered to brothels, wine merchants triple their prices, and even the laundresses demand hazard pay for handling sheets that have seen things that would make Bacchus blush. The mainstream historical fact that economists love to cite is that prostitution contributed an estimated 10 to 15% of Rome's total economy during the Renaissance. What they don't mention is how this money laundered itself through legitimate businesses faster than you could say Ave Maria. You watch Tommaso deposit his collections with Banco Bardi, where the clerk accepts the coins without batting an eye, recording them as merchant receipts in ledgers that transform whore's gold into respectable capital. This same money will finance pilgrim hostels, fund chapel decorations, and somehow emerge cleansed enough to drop into collection plates. The protection racket operates with more layers than papal vestments. Tommaso pays Luigi the knife to ensure rival pimps don't poach his girls, while Luigi pays the captain of the guard to ensure his violent activities remain technically legal. The captain pays his superior to assign him to districts where the brothels are most generous, and that superior donates heavily to the cardinal who ensures the city's vice laws remain comfortably vague. It's a vertical integration of corruption that would make the Medici banking empire look like children playing with wooden coins. The quirky historical detail that makes modern crime families look amateur is that Renaissance Roman pimps actually formed a guild, complete with patron saint, Mary Magdalene, naturally, annual feast day, and mutual aid society. They met monthly in the back room of an osteria to fix prices, divide territories, and resolve disputes without the knife work that bad for business. Tommaso shows you their unofficial charter, written in Latin so tortured it would make Cicero weep, establishing rules for everything from client poaching to the proper treatment of pregnant workers. As afternoon fades into evening, you accompany Tommaso to his most important meeting, the weekly payoff to Cardinal Orsini's secretary. The transaction happens in the sacristy of San Lorenzo because apparently nowhere is too holy for unholy business. The secretary, a thin man who sweats guilt like lesser men sweat fear, accepts a purse heavy enough to fund a small parish. In exchange, the cardinal's guards will continue ignoring the brothels on his property. The church courts will remain lenient with arrested prostitutes, and any reform-minded priests will find themselves reassigned to rural parishes where their moral outrage can bother sheep instead of sex workers. The day's final stop brings you full circle to the Vatican walls, where Tommaso points out the supreme irony of his profession. The shadow of St. Peter's Dome falls across the most expensive brothel in Rome, where cardinals' mistresses live in apartments that cost more than village churches. The protection money from this single building could feed 100 poor families, but instead it flows upward through layers of ecclesiastical bureaucracy, each official taking their cut until it reaches heights where the air is too thin for conscience to survive. Historians still argue whether this represents capitalism at its most efficient or morality at its most bankrupt, but Tommaso doesn't care about such distinctions. He just counts his coins and plans tomorrow's rounds, knowing that as long as men have desires and money to satisfy them, he'll never lack for work in the shadow of the Vatican. Pope Julius II slams his fist on the mahogany table with enough force to make the communion chalices jump, his face purple with the kind of rage usually reserved for heretics and undercooked pasta. Enough, he roars at his assembled cardinals, who shrink back like guilty schoolboys caught with their hands in the poor box, which, metaphorically speaking, they have been. Rome has become the whore of Babylon, and you've all been taking turns riding her. It's 1511, and the warrior pope has decided that military conquest isn't enough. He's declaring war on the very vice that funds half his court. You're witnessing the 15th attempt in 30 years to reform Rome's prostitution problem, and like a bad stage play, everyone knows their lines but nobody believes the performance. Julius brandishes his new bull like Moses with the tablets, reading aloud the provisions that will surely, definitely, absolutely work this time. All brothels within 200 paces of churches must close, which in Rome leaves approximately 3 buildings. All prostitutes must wear the yellow veil, again, and any cardinal caught visiting courtesans will be sternly warned. The last provision draws nervous coughs from half the sacred college, who suddenly find the ceiling frescoes fascinating. Cardinal Giuliano della Rovere, yes, the same one from the brothel, now trying to look pious, suggests perhaps a more gradual approach. Your Holiness, he ventures, surely we must consider the economic implications. These women pay taxes that fund. Julius cuts him off with a glare that could melt bronze. They fund your midnight expeditions, you mean? The accusation hangs in the air like incense at a funeral, heavy and impossible to ignore. Other cardinals shift uncomfortably, calculating whether their own nocturnal habits are about to become papal talking points. The reform begins with characteristic Roman efficiency, which is to say, it stumbles out of the gate like a drunk pilgrim. Guards raid the Borgo's most notorious establishments, arresting exactly 3 prostitutes, the ones too poor to pay bribes, while the expensive courtesans receive mysterious warnings to take convenient pilgrimages until the papal fury subsides. You watch Captain Matteo of the Papal Guard conduct a raid on Imperia's house that involves knocking politely, waiting for everyone to dress, and then declaring he found nothing inappropriate except some suspiciously rumpled bed sheets. The mainstream historical fact that makes these reforms particularly absurd is that Julius II himself had at least one acknowledged daughter from his cardinal days, making his moral crusade somewhat like an arsonist founding a fire brigade. His reform bull includes provisions for convents to accept repentant prostitutes, but the convents are already full of noble daughters whose families couldn't afford proper dowries. The Mother Superior of Santa Maria Magdalena explains the mathematics. Each reformed prostitute needs food, shelter, and constant supervision to prevent backsliding. The cost? More than the church receives from taxing 10 working prostitutes. Reform, it seems, has a terrible business model. By the 3rd week, the reform has evolved into its traditional Roman form, elaborate theater that changes nothing. Prostitutes wear yellow veils perched so precariously on their heads they fall off at the slightest breeze, requiring immediate retrieval and adjustment that involves much bending over in front of appreciative audiences. Brothels relocate exactly 201 paces from the nearest church, measured by a city surveyor who's developed a remarkably flexible understanding of distance. Cardinals continue their visits, but now bring confessors along, turning vice into a mobile sacrament that somehow makes everything technically acceptable. The quirky historical detail that nobody mentions is that Julius's reform actually increased prostitution revenues. How? By creating a black market in papal dispensations for the right price, usually negotiated by entrepreneurial clerics. Prostitutes could buy temporary exemptions from the yellow veil requirement for health reasons. Madams could purchase pilgrim hostel licenses for their establishments, technically transforming brothels into religious lodgings that happened to offer very intimate hospitality. The Vatican's bureaucracy, faced with the choice between moral purity and fiscal solvency, developed a sudden case of theological flexibility. As Christmas approaches and the reform enters its death throes, you attend a meeting where Cardinal Riario proposes a compromise that would make Machiavelli applaud. Instead of banning prostitution, why not create a holy brothel run by the church, where the women work set hours, receive regular confession, and donate half their earnings to charity? The theological gymnastics required to justify this make your head spin, but several cardinals nod thoughtfully, already calculating the revenue potential. Julius, exhausted by his own righteous fury and facing another expensive military campaign, quietly tables the discussion for further prayer and consideration. Vatican speak for let's pretend this never happened. The reform officially ends, not with a bang, but with a bookkeeping entry, as the papal treasury quietly resumes collecting brothel taxes under the new name public health fees. Julius turns his attention back to conquering Italian city-states, apparently finding it easier to breach fortress walls than Roman morals. The prostitutes return from their convenient pilgrimages. The yellow veils disappear back into storage until the next reform attempt, and life in the Borgo continues exactly as before. Historians still argue whether these reform attempts represent genuine moral concern or just periodic political theater, but the working girls of Rome knew the answer. In a city built on eternal principles, some sins are simply too profitable to truly condemn. The chestnuts bounce across the marble floor like tiny brown dice determining tonight's carnal winners as 50 naked courtesans scramble on all fours, their pale flesh glowing in the light of 1,000 candles that turn the apostolic palace into hell's own chandelier. You're witnessing the infamous banquet of chestnuts. October 30th, 1501, where Pope Alexander VI and his son Cesare Borgia have transformed the papal residence into a scene that would make Nero blush and Caligula take notes. The official Vatican record will later describe this as a private theatrical performance, which is like calling the Great Flood a minor plumbing issue. Cesare lounges on a throne that technically belongs to St. Peter's successor, wine-drunk and watching the spectacle with the detached amusement of a man who's already violated so many commandments he's working on bonus rounds. The 50 courtesans, Rome's finest professionals hired at premium rates, compete to collect chestnuts with their teeth while cardinals place bets on who'll gather the most. Cardinal Piccolomini turns to his neighbor and mutters something about how this gives new meaning to gathering the fruits of the earth, before remembering he's supposed to be scandalized and adjusting his expression accordingly. The banquet tables groan under the weight of delicacies that cost more than most parishes see in a year. Roasted peacocks redressed in their feathers, sugar sculptures of naked nymphs that melt obscenely in the heat, and wine from the papal cellars that's older than some of the prostitutes. You notice the irony of the menu. Each course is served on plates bearing images of saints who definitely didn't die for this. Saint Agnes stares up reproachfully from a platter of oysters arranged in suggestive patterns, while Saint Catherine's martyrdom decorates bowls of figs split open like things that shouldn't be compared to fruit in polite company. The mainstream historical record remains diplomatically vague about what happened after the chestnut gathering, but Johann Burchard, the papal master of ceremonies, wrote it all down with the detailed precision of a German accountant documenting the apocalypse. After sufficient wine and entertainment, prizes were announced for those who could perform the act of Venus most frequently. The papal apartments, consecrated space where saints' relics rest in golden reliquaries, became an arena for competitive copulation that would make Roman gladiatorial games look like church picnics. Servants circulate with silver platters of aphrodisiacs, candied ginger, ground rhinoceros horn, actually just expensive chalk, but nobody's checking, and a Spanish fly concoction that's already sent two cardinals running for the latrines. The Borgia Pope himself, Alexander VI, presides over the festivities with the benevolent smile of a grandfather at a family gathering. If your grandfather happened to be watching his bastard children organize Vatican orgies, he occasionally points out particularly athletic performances to the Venetian ambassador, who's trying to memorize every detail for the explosive report that will scandalize and titillate the Doge's court. The quirky historical detail that makes this evening even more surreal is that it occurred during the Jubilee year, when pilgrims flocked to Rome for special indulgences, while the faithful kept vigil in St. Peter's Square below. Their spiritual father hosted a sexual Olympics one floor above. Some pilgrims reported seeing strange shadows dancing in the papal windows and hearing sounds they optimistically interpreted as angels singing with unusual enthusiasm. And the Swiss guards stationed outside maintained expressions of stone-faced professionalism that would crack years later in tavern confessions. As dawn approaches and various churchmen stagger toward matins in states of undress that would challenge even the most creative theologian to explain, you witness the aftermath of absolute power corrupted absolutely. Courtesans count their earnings. Cesare Borgia paid bonuses for creativity that would fund small businesses, while servants begin the delicate task of removing evidence. Stained tapestries disappear into storage. Furniture is rearranged to hide suspicious damage, and enough incense burns to fumigate a cathedral, all in preparation for the morning's papal mass, where Alexander will consecrate the host with the same hands that just hours ago were blessing entirely different flesh. The true scandal isn't just the orgy itself. Rome has seen plenty of those, but the brazenness of holding it in the papal palace, turning sacred space into a brothel with better decorations. Cardinals who participated will go on to vote in the next papal conclave, their sins forgotten in the political calculus of church governance. The courtesans return to their regular establishments with stories that will become legend, told in whispers to clients who want to hear about the night the Vatican dropped its mask entirely. Historians still argue whether the banquet of chestnuts represents the absolute nadir of papal corruption or just the most well-documented example of what happened regularly behind apostolic walls. Either way, you've witnessed the moment when the Renaissance papacy achieved peak decadence, making every previous scandal look like a parish bake sale, and setting a bar for ecclesiastical debauchery that even the Borgias would struggle to top again. Giulio Romano's paintbrush hovers over the canvas like a priest uncertain whether to bless or curse as the afternoon light streams through his studio windows, illuminating both his latest commission, a Madonna and Child for Cardinal Farnese, and the decidedly unvirginal model posing for it. You're watching Francesca della Rovere, one of Rome's most expensive courtesans, transform into the Mother of God through the alchemy of art, her knowing smile becoming beatific, her practiced seduction morphing into maternal grace. The irony is lost on no one. The same woman who charged cardinals by the hour last night will spend eternity gazing down from church walls, receiving prayers from wives who'd faint if they knew their holy intercessor's professional resume. The studio buzzes with the creative energy of Renaissance Rome, where the sacred and profane mix like pigments on a palette. Giulio's assistant grinds lapis lazuli for the Virgin's robes while stealing glances at Francesca's exposed shoulder, trying to reconcile the flesh he's sketching with the holy figure it represents. She holds the pose with professional patience. After all, modeling pays almost as well as her night work and doesn't require nearly as much washing afterward. Between sessions, she discusses Neoplatonic philosophy with Giulio, because Renaissance courtesans don't just sell their bodies, they rent their minds to artists seeking intellectual stimulation between sexual encounters. The walls of the studio tell their own story of this peculiar economy. Sketches of courtesans turned saints cover every surface. There's Imperia as Mary Magdalene, naturally, Beatrice Ferrara as Saint Catherine, and at least 3 different prostitutes who've posed as the Virgin Mary, creating a theological paradox where the Mother of God has multiple earthly incarnations, all of whom charge by the hour. The mainstream historical fact that art historians desperately try to ignore is that many of Renaissance Rome's most revered religious paintings feature sex workers as holy figures, meaning countless faithful have unknowingly prayed to prostitutes for intercession. Cardinal Bibbiena arrives for his sitting. He's commissioning a series of mythological frescoes that require significantly less clothing than his public position would suggest. He greets Francesca with the casual familiarity of a regular client, discussing her rates for both modeling and private consultations with the same matter-of-fact tone he uses for ordering communion wine. Giulio pretends not to notice when they disappear into the back room for a brief theological discussion that involves suspicious rhythmic thumping and emerges with the cardinal's zucchetto askew. The quirky historical detail that transforms our understanding of Renaissance art is that many courtesans actually controlled their own image rights. Francesca shows you her contract with Giulio, written in impeccable Latin by her secretary, specifying which poses she'll accept, which biblical figures she'll portray, and most importantly, which clients can purchase the finished works. She's building a portfolio of holy portraits that will outlive her beauty, ensuring that when age forces retirement from her current profession, she'll have residual income from print reproductions sold to pilgrims who have no idea they're venerating a prostitute. The afternoon's work is interrupted by a commotion outside. Marcus Antonius Raimondi, the engraver, is being arrested for his latest series of prints, I Modi, or The Positions, which feature detailed depictions of 16 sexual positions inspired by frescoes in Cardinal Chigi's bathroom. The guards confiscate the plates, while Raimondi protests that he's merely documenting classical mythology, though it's hard to argue when position 12 clearly shows a cardinal's hat in the corner. Francesca laughs, noting that she modeled for position 7 and demanding her fee before they destroy the evidence. As sunset approaches and Francesca transforms back from the virgin into her professional self. You realize you've witnessed something profound about Renaissance Rome's ability to compartmentalize. The same artists who create transcendent religious art spend their evenings in brothels sketching studies for their next martyrdom scene. Courtesans pose as saints by day and entertain churchmen by night, their bodies becoming palimpsests where sacred and profane overwrite each other endlessly. The paintings that result hang in churches where priests who know exactly who modeled for them deliver sermons on chastity without a trace of irony. Giulio puts the finishing touches on the Madonna's face, capturing something in Francesca's expression that transcends her profession, a humanity that makes the divine accessible, or perhaps reveals the divine in the human. She examines the work critically, suggesting adjustments to the mouth that would make her look more maternal and less like she's suppressing a laugh at the cosmic joke of it all. Tomorrow this painting will be installed in Cardinal Farnese's private chapel, where he'll pray to a prostitute's image for divine intervention, completing a circle of irony so perfect it could only happen in Rome. Historians still argue whether this represents the democratization of sanctity or its complete debasement, but the courtesans counting their modeling fees don't care about such distinctions. They're too busy becoming immortal, one brushstroke at a time. Martin Luther's pamphlet hits Rome like a theological artillery shell. Its crude woodcut illustrations of fornicating popes and pregnant nuns spreading through the city's printing shops faster than syphilis through a brothel. You're standing in the workshop of Antonio Blotto, papal printer by day and distributor of Protestant propaganda by night, because in Rome, even heresy is a business opportunity. The pamphlet, The Roman Babylon Revealed, features Pope Leo X blessing a parade of prostitutes while St. Peter weeps in the corner, and the accuracy of the caricature is what makes it sting. Every Protestant reformer from Wittenberg to Geneva is using Rome's sexual economy as ammunition, and the Vatican's counter-arguments sound hollow when half the College of Cardinals keeps courtesans on retainer. The irony thickens when Cardinal Campeggio summons Blotto to print the official papal response, a treatise defending clerical celibacy that Campeggio dictates while his mistress, conveniently titled his housekeeper, brings them wine. The cardinal doesn't see the contradiction, or perhaps sees it so clearly he's gone blind, as he thunders about Protestant lies while his 3 illegitimate children play in the garden outside. Blotto takes notes with the poker face of a man who's printed both papal bulls and their satirical rebuttals, sometimes on the same day, because theological consistency doesn't pay the bills, but playing both sides does. You follow the pamphlet's journey through Rome's underground network of Protestant sympathizers, many of whom are prostitutes tired of being condemned by the very men who pay for their services. Margarita, who works near the German quarter, translates Luther's arguments into Roman dialect while her clients sleep off their post-coital exhaustion. She finds particular satisfaction in the passage about whores in holy vestments, having serviced enough bishops to know that sometimes the vestments stay on during the act. The mainstream historical fact that Catholic historians hate acknowledging is that Protestant propaganda found its most eager audience among Rome's sex workers, who had intimate knowledge of clerical hypocrisy. The Vatican's damage control efforts resemble a man trying to bail out a sinking ship with a sieve. Cardinal Sadoleto writes eloquent defenses of the Roman Church's moral authority, while his secretary maintains a coded ledger of payments to various spiritual advisors who provide very temporal services. The official line is that Protestant accounts are wild exaggerations, but every Roman streetwalker can name which cardinal prefers blondes, which bishop pays extra for discretion, and which papal nephew has tastes that would make Caligula squeamish. Luther doesn't need to exaggerate when reality provides sufficient ammunition. The quirky historical detail that transforms this from mere scandal to cosmic farce is that many Protestant reformers visiting Rome to gather evidence of corruption ended up sampling the very vices they came to condemn. Hans Holbein the Younger arrives to sketch scenes of Roman depravity for a reformed Basel publisher, but gets so distracted by the courtesans willing to pose that he extends his stay by 6 months. A Calvinist spy sent to document clerical misconduct sends back reports so detailed about brothel practices that Geneva suspects he's conducting too much first-hand research. In the taverns where German merchants gather, Luther's ideas spread like wine stains on white cloth. They read aloud accounts of the banquet of chestnuts. Remember those chestnuts rolling across papal floors, and toast each revelation of Vatican vice. One merchant, Johann Fugger, notes that his Protestant clients back in Augsburg can't get enough of these Roman scandal sheets, which sell better than indulgences ever did. He's making a fortune shipping north the very propaganda that undermines the spiritual authority of his biggest customer, the Pope. But money has no denomination, and gold speaks all languages fluently. The crisis deepens when Pasquino, Rome's talking statue, where anonymous critics post satirical verses, sports a new decoration, a papal tiara fashioned from yellow veils, the symbol of prostitution crowning the symbol of spiritual authority. The authorities tear it down, but by morning 5 more appear throughout the city. The Protestant propagandists have found the perfect weapon, Rome's own reality. Every reformed prostitute Luther claims to have saved in Germany is matched by 50 new recruits in the Vatican's shadow, and every sermon about Roman corruption finds fresh examples daily. As you watch Cardinal Del Monte prepare yet another futile response to Protestant attacks, his prose interrupted by messengers arranging his evening entertainment, you realize you're witnessing the Reformation's secret weapon. Luther didn't need to invent Rome's sins. He just needed to publicize them. The city that claimed spiritual authority over all Christendom had become Exhibit A in the case against itself. Historians still argue whether Protestant accounts were propaganda or journalism, but the distinction hardly matters when the truth is more damning than any lie could be. The working girls of Rome, meanwhile, continue their trade, now serving not just as outlets for clerical lust, but as unwitting foot soldiers in a theological war where their very existence becomes evidence for the prosecution. The Council of Trent's final session draws to a close like a funeral dirge for the Rome you've come to know, its reformist decrees falling on the Eternal City like snow on a brothel's red lanterns, beautiful, pure, and destined to melt at first contact with reality. You're witnessing December 1563, when the Counter-Reformation finally grows teeth sharp enough to bite the hand that feeds it, and that hand wears more rings than a cardinal has mistresses. The assembled bishops, many nursing private guilt about their own nocturnal adventures, vote to enforce clerical celibacy with renewed vigor, as if saying it louder will make it true this time. The reforms read like a greatest hits of previous failures. Priests must actually live in their parishes. Revolutionary concept. Bishops can't openly keep concubines. Secretly is still negotiable. And brothels near churches must close. They'll measure that distance very creatively. But this time feels different. There's a chill in the air that has nothing to do with December weather. Pope Pius IV, looking like a man who's discovered his wine, has turned to vinegar, signs the decrees with a hand that trembles either from age or the knowledge that he's signing away a significant portion of Vatican revenue. In the Borgo, the news spreads through the brothels faster than a cardinal fleeing a raid. Imperia's successor, a courtesan named Tullia, who inherited both the house and the clientele, holds an emergency meeting of Rome's premier prostitutes. They discuss options with the strategic acumen of generals facing invasion. Relocate to Venice, where the rules are laxer. Rebrand as widows seeking consolation, or weather the storm like their predecessors have, through 15 previous reform attempts. The consensus, reached over wine that costs more than a priest's annual salary, is to wait and see. Rome has a short memory when it comes to inconvenient morality. The immediate effects are more theatrical than theological. Cardinals suddenly discover urgent business in their rural dioceses, leaving Rome in a mass exodus that resembles rats deserting a sinking ship if the rats wore red silk and traveled in gilded carriages. Those who remain develop a sudden fascination with late-night prayer vigils that happen to take them past certain familiar addresses. The Swiss guards, tasked with enforcing the new morality, patrol with the enthusiasm of men who know their own evening entertainments are at stake. But something has shifted in the air, a change as subtle and irreversible as the moment wine turns. The Protestant propagandists have won a victory they didn't expect. They've shamed Rome into attempting actual reform. The mainstream historical fact that marks this era's end is the establishment of the convertite, convents specifically for reformed prostitutes, which actually receive funding and support instead of just pious intentions. Some courtesans genuinely convert, trading silk for rough wool and earthly pleasures for heavenly promises. Though cynics note, they tend to be the ones whose beauty has faded beyond what candlelight can hide. You watch the strangest funeral procession, courtesans dressed as penitents, carrying their yellow veils to be burned in the Campo de' Fiori, the same square where heretics meet their fiery end. The symbolism is heavy-handed enough to make a Dominican blush, but there's something genuinely moving about watching these women cast off the symbols of their shame, even if everyone knows half of them will be back at work tomorrow. The quirky historical detail that nobody mentions is that many prostitutes kept their yellow veils as souvenirs, later selling them to collectors who wanted authentic pieces of old Rome's scandal. Cardinal Borromeo, the reform's most zealous champion, personally leads raids on the remaining brothels, though his fervor is somewhat undermined by having to repeatedly ask directions to establishments everyone else seems to find easily. He creates new punishments for clerical incontinence that read like Baroque poetry. Priests caught with prostitutes must make pilgrimages barefoot. Bishops lose their revenues, and cardinals face the ultimate sanction, public embarrassment. The fact that enforcement requires someone to actually report these violations creates a loophole large enough to drive a papal carriage through. As 1564 dawns and the reform settles over Rome like an uncomfortable new cassock, you realize you're witnessing not an ending, but a transformation. The blatant public displays of vice retreat into private shadows. The open brothels become discreet apartments, and the courtesans who once flaunted their cardinal lovers now meet them in elaborate masquerades of propriety. The economy of sin doesn't disappear. It just learns to speak in whispers instead of shouts. The final image burns itself into your memory, the dome of St. Peter's, still under construction, rising against a sunset sky the color of old wine. Below it, in streets you've walked through centuries of scandal, the last publicly recognized courtesan of the Renaissance locks her door and hangs a sign, "Rooms for rent to respectable widows only." The Reformation has won its symbolic victory, but Rome remains eternal, and eternity has always been flexible about the definition of sin. The prostitutes haven't disappeared, they've simply learned, like the church itself, that survival sometimes requires changing your clothes while keeping your profession. The great wheel of Roman hypocrisy hasn't stopped turning, it's just learned to rotate more quietly. The shadows grow longer now across the ancient stones of Rome, stretching like gentle fingers ready to pull you back from this journey through time. The bells of St. Peter's ring the evening hour, their bronze voices softer now, more forgiving perhaps, as if they too have learned that judgment comes easier than understanding. You've walked through centuries of contradiction, witnessed the eternal dance between flesh and spirit, seen how even in the shadow of humanity's highest aspirations, our most basic nature persists like weeds in a cathedral garden. The streets are quieter in your mind now, those narrow alleys of the Borgo where yellow veils once fluttered like condemned butterflies. They're just streets again. The brothels have become apartments. The courtesans have faded into history's margins, and the cardinals who loved them sleep beneath marble tombs that mention only their ecclesiastical achievements. Time has a way of washing even the most scarlet sins into sepia tones, until what once scandalized becomes merely curious, what once burned becomes merely warm. Close your eyes and let the last images drift past like boats on the Tiber. There goes Imperia in her silk and jewels, brilliant as a comet and just as temporary. Behind her, countless unnamed women who sold what they had to survive in a city that condemned them by day and sought them by night. See the princes of the church, neither wholly evil nor wholly good, just men caught between heaven's demands and earth's desires, failing at sanctity in such spectacularly human ways that perhaps there's a strange holiness in their very failure to be holy. The Renaissance. Rome you visited exists now only in whispers, in the knowing smile of a Madonna who looks too worldly, in the account books buried in Vatican archives, in the stones that have heard too many confessions to judge anyone. The city remains eternal, but eternity, you've learned, is less about unchanging perfection and more about the endless repetition of human nature in all its flawed glory. The same desires that drove cardinals to brothels drive different scandals today, dressed in different clothes, but dancing the same ancient dance. Let your breathing slow now. Let the weight of all those stories settle gently, like dust on old manuscripts. You're back in your own time, your own bed, your own moral complexities that would probably seem just as absurd to someone watching from 5 centuries hence. The prostitutes of Renaissance Rome have long since made their final confessions. Their clients have faced whatever judgment awaits hypocrites and humanitarians alike. And the city continues its eternal business of pretending to be holy while being magnificently, irrepressibly human. Sleep is coming now, soft as silk, gentle as absolution, carrying you away from the Borgo's narrow streets and the Vatican's broad hypocrisies. Dream, if you dream at all, of a place where yellow veils become golden halos, where courtesans become saints, where cardinals find forgiveness for being exactly what God made them, neither angels nor demons, but something far more interesting. Human beings stumbling toward grace through a city that promised heaven but delivered earth in all its messy, vital, impossibly beautiful confusion. Good night, dear listener. May your dreams be more merciful than history, and may you wake tomorrow grateful that your own sins, whatever they might be, won't be remembered 5 centuries from now by someone trying to fall asleep to the sound of ancient scandals. Rest now. Even the eternal city sleeps sometimes.